So I'm going to start by having Bobby introduce himself to us.
Bobby Menezes. I'm in California, and I work at Netflix. I manage a couple teams that's focused on capacity, and we've been really busy the last couple months trying to make sure that all these folks that are staying home can watch all the content that they want, because it can be kind of tough being stuck at home. Like, I know.
Yeah, we're all feeling that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time, Bobby. So I'm gonna interview you, ask you a few questions related to how to run an effective online meeting. So you'll just share with us from your experience. So first question is, what free technology can be used for hosting online meetings right now? And how would you recommend choosing one provider or platform over another?
So I think a key thing is knowing your audience. If you're typically working within your organization, looking at what tools you already have and what integrates well with that is going to make it as seamless as possible. For example, we're big on Google, so we use Google Meet mostly. I know Brianna does too. So Google Meet works great for us. I would say that sometimes there's meetings where you want to get really large group of people on the screen at the same time, maybe a happy hour or a large cross-functional meeting where it's important to see all the different people who are participating. Sometimes we'll use technology like Zoom because they have a little bit better multi-person display. We call it the Brady Bunch display. With Google, you get very small subset of that. With Zoom, I think you can get about 50 people on the screen. I haven't used the Microsoft ecosystem in a while, but they have their own video conferencing solutions too. But you can use whatever. If you're having a small one-on-one and both people have an iPhone, use FaceTime. Whatever's easiest for you, WhatsApp, all of them work pretty well. So try and figure out what your audience is going to have and kind of gravitate to that, I think is my recommendation there.
Right. And would you say though, like choose one and commit to it so it's not as confusing, the different features of the different platforms and servers, or does it matter?
I think in general, if you're not doing it on a regular basis, it's probably best to commit to one platform. But like I said, there are certain use cases where I will go outside of the Google ecosystem and use Zoom because I want that functionality.
Right.
And the technology has gotten pretty easy to use. So I think once they use it, they kind of get over that hump, whether it's Zoom or Google or Microsoft.
Right. Okay, great. Yes, there's so many free options out there. So I'm sure everybody can find one that they like. So how does your setup and preparation for an online meeting look the same or different from what you would normally do for an in-person one?
So there's a lot of things that you give up in video that you would normally have in a room with people. There's the subtle cues, there's the noises, the facial expressions. A lot of that stuff is harder to pick up in a video conference. So one of the things I think is important is to have a good setup. So when you're in a room sitting at a table with people, you're looking at them at eye level most of the time. So you can do creative stuff like make sure that your laptop is propped up in a way so that you're not looking up at the person or looking down. It's not normal to have, this perspective or that perspective. So try and make it feel like you're having that one-on-one conversation or you're in the same room as much as possible. Lighting is a tough one. I definitely recommend, like I'm sitting in front of a window over here to my left. I've got a little bit of background lighting to try and make sure I don't have those harsh shadows, and people can see my expressions. If I'm smiling, it's important for people to see that. If I'm frowning, it's also important for people to see that. And I think when you're having team meetings, especially ones where you're talking about strategy or decisions that are being made, it's really helpful to know how the other people are perceiving that. So I would recommend, making sure your camera is always on, if you can do that. I know that's not possible for everybody. And there's two schools of thought on muting. If you've got a lot of background noise, then you got to mute so that the meeting can stay productive. But if possible, I think generally I would recommend try not to mute. Try and have your participants not mute, especially if it's an interactive team meeting. So for example, if you're muted and I say something like, hey, we're going to go run in this direction, and you think it's the wrong direction, and you go, oh, I'm not going to pick up that cue that I would in the room. So you should try and think about those aspects of it. So spend the time 5 minutes before a meeting, make sure you get your lighting as much as, and your setup as good as you can, so that the people you're meeting with can really have the best experience they can over video.
Right. I know. I'm feeling like my lighting is not as good as yours.
I spent a little bit of time on it.
Yeah, I'll have to work on that one. One thing I've noticed for myself is like it's easier for my hands to be distracted right now, or to like feel less engaged because it is over a screen. And like, yeah, I really like the verbal or like looking people in the eye and nodding along, and I just don't feel like that's happening as much. Do you have any advice on how do you maintain focus and getting distracted?
Sorry, a little bit of background noise here. Fire truck driving by. I think that it's a skill that we all have to work on. I'm really bad about pulling out my phone here, and I read a notification, and now all of a sudden I'm not engaged.
Right.
And I would say the key to that is really focusing on your agenda, making sure that the agenda, everybody knows what the agenda is, what the expectations are in the meeting for all the participants. So if I'm really looking for feedback from you as part of the meeting, you need to know that so that you pay attention and you're really participating. If it's a status meeting where people are just going down the list and, hey, some of this stuff may not apply to me, it's very likely that you're going to have some people who get distracted, especially with computers. Watching the news, you see a lot of people having video conferencing interviews, and you hear their phone ring, you hear their Skype ding, and iMessage. Your computer doesn't just do one thing, and now you're asking it to do video conferencing. So now all those other things can be distracting. If you've got a do not disturb, try turning that on, your phone and your computer during meetings, and that'll help you maybe stay engaged.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Yeah, if possible, to have do not disturb, because yeah, the emails coming in or different things can definitely be distracting. It's great advice.
Leave your camera on as a participant, and you will pay more attention because there's a chance that people will see that you're not paying attention.
Yes, that is so true. Definitely a good reason to keep your video on. What are some best practices during an online meeting if you are the host? And then I'll also ask you as an attendee, but how would those things differ?
I think we kind of touched on it a little bit. Try and set yourself up to really be visible so people can engage with you in the way that they would normally. If it's really dark in the room and they can't see you, it's more like a phone call, and you should expect that you're not going to get that same kind of engagement from your participants. Spend the extra 3 to 5 minutes before the meeting making sure that everything's working technically so that you can help anybody who's participating with their technical issues and not trying to figure your own out. And then a key thing, again, depending on the kind of meeting you're trying to have, I think it's important to have an agenda, kind of a goal, and really state upfront what your expectations are from people on the call so that they know what to expect. Am I supposed to be chiming in here? Is this a one-way conversation? Is this a dialogue? So that I kind of know what to do. I think that's important from a leader standpoint.
Right. I mean, which is very similar to an in-person meeting. It's always good when the focus of the meeting is clear and people involved know what to expect. So that's something that we can take from an in-person meeting and put into an online format.
Yeah.
Yeah, anything else for attendees of meetings that we haven't touched on?
I think on the attendee side, I would try my best to basically hold the person holding the meeting responsible for making sure that they do those things. So if you're not seeing an agenda, it's not clear what the meeting is for, make sure that they say that at the beginning of the meeting. Hey, so what do you want from me in this meeting? It's not clear. I'm not sure what the goal is. Can you help us all understand? And maybe also ask them to set some ground rules. Like, do you want this to be interactive? If it's 5 people, maybe that works okay. If it's 50 people, are we going to raise our hands? Are we going to type it into questions in a chat window? How are we going to figure out who talks next so we're not all talking over each other?
Right. Oh, I liked a couple of those things. What is your suggestion on like people putting something in the chat versus saying something aloud? Is there a best practice around that?
I try and keep VC meetings into 2 categories. It's either, at most 14 people or more than 14 people. And if it's more than 14 people, I pretty much treat it more as there's a scheduled agenda and a Google Doc where people can post questions, and then you have a handful of speakers that are mostly answering those questions, more like a town hall. And if it's under 14, we try our best to stay off mute, camera on, and look at all of the people and try and see when people want to speak up, maybe raise a hand and those type of things. I think the chat window works okay, but it becomes another one of those distractions where now I'm not looking at the people, I'm looking at the chat window. That's okay, but it can be overwhelming. You can lose your audience pretty quickly, or even lose your own place pretty quickly with all that stuff going on.
Definitely. And how do you try and navigate who's talking when you have up to 14 people? Do you do a raised hand or just people chime in? Do you have a good strategy for that?
So I look for when people are either talking over each other or trying to make room for each other, and then make sure that the person who didn't get a chance to speak up gets called on next. And then the other thing I try and do is what you do in real meeting, not real meetings, but in-person meetings too, is there are people who are happy to volunteer their opinions, and then there's other folks who just need a little more coaxing. So I try and poll the room, or if somebody hasn't talked for a while, hey, so-and-so, do you have any thoughts on this? Just make sure everybody feels like they're participating and that they're getting opportunities to speak up. It is definitely more of an art than a science.
Right. I feel like it's important that you know your participants, which hopefully if you're interacting with your usual team, you should know who needs to be called out to get their response, and who maybe will always be sharing. How do you, in an online meeting, I'm just going off script here, I have so many questions. I know in an in-person meeting, some strategies for trying to like contain somebody who's like a little bit more talkative or may tend to dominate the conversation. How do you try and do that in an online meeting?
And so far, it's mostly using the exact same processes. It's like, okay, I think we understand, your perspective on this, and then call on somebody who hasn't spoken. And usually they pick up on those cues. Let me see, some of the other things that we do is, hey, we haven't heard from several folks in the room. Can we get maybe somebody to volunteer to speak about this? Again, another cue to, hey, if you've talked recently, maybe,
maybe
slow it
take
down. I have been in other meetings that are larger in nature or a little more complex to navigate, and they do the raised hand thing, and typing that in the chat window, and then somebody's kind of responsible for keeping track of who raised hands in which order. And I definitely have seen people go, okay, you know, you've already talked. Let's go ahead and go to this other person, make sure that we get enough different voices in the room to chime in on this topic. So it's very similar to what you would do in a real in-person meeting.
If there is some chat involved, do you recommend having like a second kind of facilitator of the meeting so that the person who's leading isn't distracted by that chat?
If we had a interactive town hall with, say, maybe higher than that number of 14 people, like say 25 people, I would delegate some responsibilities to helping me manage that meeting. So part of it would be tracking who's got questions, and then somebody also would be responsible for who has something to comment on this. So tracking the raised hands, because like I said, it's very easy to get off topic or even lose your place, and trying to jump back and forth between screens, you'll definitely lose your audience very quickly. So it's okay to have 2 or 3 people helping you facilitate your meeting. And actually recommend it.
Yes, I could see that'd be very helpful. Great, thanks, Bobby. So what are some common challenges you face with online meetings, and how do you handle those?
One of the most common things I've seen that we've had to work on is dissenting opinions not being brought up during the meeting. This can happen in real meetings too, but I think in general, as you get to know your audience and your team, you can pick up the cues a little bit easier and go, I'm getting the sense, Joe, that you don't agree with this. Can you share your thoughts on this? Sometimes you may not pick that up in a video meeting, especially if you can't see everybody's face, or you're trying to process 16 faces on the screen at the same time. So what will happen is you'll have this meeting, and then either an hour go by or a day or go by or two, and go, hey, you guys talked about this and we decided to do this thing, but I'm not in agreement for this reason and that. So really trying to work through that has been a bigger challenge, I think, for folks who are used to being in the room. You definitely can't rely on your previous EQ skills all the time, because I can't hear I can't see the head nods to no or yes. I can't see the grimaces as much as I could, and I definitely can't hear the that, not that there was a lot of it, but you could pick it up when it was there. So I think there's that, and then there is something that's a little more personal. Is for some reason, whatever it is, it's just like public speaking. As soon as you turn on that red light or you turn on that camera, people get nervous. It's like, oh, I don't want to be on camera, and have no problem being in a room and having the conversation. It's the same group of people, but there's just something about being on camera that makes them feel uncomfortable. And that's a tougher one, because there's no quick fix for that. It's just getting people used to this situation.
So would you say that one's just like with time they become more comfortable, or is there any way that you can encourage them to just be a little more natural?
I think it's 2 things: is understand that is the situation. So when they're muting their mic or turning off their camera, if these are people on your team, spend the time kind of talking through that, understanding it, and see if there isn't ways that you can help them through that. And then, I think, just kind of easing them into it. Maybe don't call on them every meeting, call on them every other meeting so they can start to get used to it.
Right, right.
Or ask them to create a partnership with somebody else where they can chat over the messages or questions that they have so that they feel like they can still voice their stuff without having to speak up on camera yet. Hasn't been a huge problem, but it is something that you have to work on. I think the other challenge is, for me personally, I very much enjoyed it. Didn't know I did, but I very much enjoyed that I would have to get up from my desk or from the table in a conference room and walk over to another room before I went to the next meeting. And I used to think that people who, because there's a lot of folks I work with that work from home all the time, I was like, oh, they have it so much easier because they just hit a button, they switch meetings.
Right.
I actually dislike that I go from meeting to meeting to meeting without that little, reset of just getting up and resetting and kind of going through that. And I've been trying to figure that one out. I haven't quite yet figured out. But there'll be times, even though I have back-to-back meetings, I may wait a minute before joining the next because I just can't go right into the next one.
Right. Yeah. Something about not having good closure or just even a little break, maybe.
Yeah.
So that you can shift your mind and.
Yeah.
Kind
of just.
Challenging one.
I think of those little boards with the sand where you flip them over, and I can't remember the name of what that's called. But just having that between meetings, of getting up and moving, kind of reset the brain so I could be present for the next meeting.
Right. Right. Yeah. What about any technology problems? People showing up late? Do you wait for them? Anything else that comes to mind in terms of challenges?
So I would say in general, we try and start our meetings within the 1 to 3 minute mark of the scheduled time. Right now it's not working from home. It's working from home during a pandemic. I think we talked about this a little bit earlier. I think you need to be a little bit more patient and understanding. People are balancing a lot of different things, whether it's coming from a meeting or trying to help their child with their homework or just trying to get a bite or a bathroom break in there. If you don't know what's going on with other people's schedule, try and be a little bit more forgiving. So I think we try and be thoughtful. If there's an agenda item that's particularly important to get somebody's input on, or you think that they would be upset if they missed it, adjust your agenda in real time. We're going to go ahead and start to be cognizant so people can keep their schedules. And then when Bobby joins, we'll talk about this item because I know it's important for Bobby to talk about it. I think I would be a little less flexible in a normal work environment than I am right now on that, and that's okay.
Yeah.
On the technology side, try and get everybody to test their stuff out at least a couple times when it's an important meeting and there's a lot of people showing up, because you don't want to spend a bunch of time troubleshooting one person's microphone with 30 people waiting.
Right.
And I would almost say that technology probably shouldn't put the meeting on hold more than a minute or two. If that's a problem, hey, we'll record or we'll catch you up afterwards, but you're going to have to put all your questions in chat or something along those lines.
Yeah. And I find that it's good, especially if you're using a new platform that you're not used to just try signing into the meeting a few minutes early to make sure that if you do encounter problems, you have a few minutes of wiggle room to figure it out before the meeting starts.
Yeah. It is hard as the preparer for a meeting. A lot of times you'll make sure that you have ample time to do that. But for people who are attending the meeting, you don't always know what their schedule is. And they could be coming from a Zoom meeting right now, which finishes at the hour mark, and then starting a Google meeting, and there's challenges with that. So. But as the moderator or the person holding the meeting, you can definitely reduce the amount of tension for the meeting by at least having all of your stuff kind of aligned.
Ready. Great. Just 2 more questions for you. How does finishing, wrapping up the meeting, and the follow-up post-meeting look similar or different from in-person meetings?
For me, these are not significantly different than in-person meetings, but I still think they're good hygiene for meetings. Is if your agenda runs short, you should close the meeting short. Don't just because it's an hour scheduled, you don't have to hold it for a whole hour. People appreciate that. I think people really appreciate it in this particular time frame. Anytime they can get back to focus on the other stuff that they have waiting outside of this meeting. So I think that's important. I have a staff meeting that's usually scheduled for an hour. This week we were done in a half hour. Made sure, did a poll. Is there anything else anybody wants to add? Is there anything anybody wants to talk about? No, don't put pressure on people to feel like they have to fill that other 30 minutes. Okay, well, 30 minutes back to you. I think that's a good thing. If you're having meetings and you're not hearing from folks that you would typically hear from, before you close out the meeting, call on those folks, make sure that they've gotten an opportunity to speak up. They may just be struggling with trying to figure out how to work within the video conferencing world of trying to chime in and ask questions or give their context.
Right. Okay, great. And then any last advice or thoughts around how to run an effective online meeting? I
think we covered most of it. I don't think I've got any nuggets left, so I think you've got it all.
Perfect. Thanks, Bobby.
No problem.